Amina entered her husband Kofi's ancestral village with a heart full of quiet hope, believing marriage would finally give her the dignity and peace she had long prayed for. But from the very first day she stepped into her mother-in-law Mom Essie's compound, she sensed an invisible wall rising around her, built from cold stares, sharp words, and silent judgment. As Mom Essie examined her like an unwanted burden, questioning her background, her manners, even the softness of her voice, making it clear that Amina was not the woman she had dreamed of for her son. And each morning before the sun fully rose, Amina was forced to wake, sweep the compound, fetch water from the distant stream, cook meals that were never praised, and endure insults disguised as advice, while Mom Essie constantly reminded her that she was lucky to be allowed into the family at all, mocking her inability to bring wealth, land, or influence into the marriage. And when neighbors visited, the old woman spoke loudly about Amina's supposed laziness and ignorance, turning her into a public joke. Yet Amina endured everything in silence, believing patience was the price of peace, hoping time would soften her mother-in-law's heart. But instead, cruelty grew roots, and when Amina became pregnant, she expected at least a moment of kindness, only to hear Mom Essie complain that the pregnancy would make her even more useless, accusing her of pretending sickness to avoid work, forcing her to labor until her back burned with pain. And when she finally gave birth to a baby boy named Kojo, Amina felt a brief wave of joy, thinking the child would unite the family. But Mom Essie looked at the newborn with suspicion rather than love, whispering that the boy's cry sounded strange, claiming his eyes held misfortune, and spreading quiet rumors that Amina had used charms to trap Kofi and produce a cursed child, words that slowly poisoned the minds of villagers, isolating Amina further, while Kofi, trapped between tradition and love, chose silence, believing his mother's behavior was normal discipline, unaware that silence can wound deeper than shouting. And as weeks turned into months, Amina noticed how Kojo flinched whenever Mom Essie entered the room, how his tiny hands clutched her wrapper as if sensing danger, and though he was just a child, fear already lived in his eyes, while Mom Essie continued her bullying, criticizing how Amina breastfed, how she bathed the baby, even accusing her of intentionally making the child cry to gain sympathy. And at night, when the compound finally fell quiet, Amina would sit under the stars, with Kojo pressed to her chest, whispering prayers through tears, asking the ancestors for strength, begging for a sign that her suffering had meaning, never knowing that this cruelty was shaping a story far greater than her pain, a story that would one day expose the true cost of bullying and test the limits of a mother's endurance. As the first shadows of fate quietly began to gather around her and her son, as Kojo grew older, the cruelty within Mom Essie's heart no longer hid behind sharp words alone, but began to take shape in actions that cut deeper. And the child who should have known warmth and laughter instead learned fear before he learned full sentences, because every small mistake became proof in his grandmother's eyes that he carried something bad within him, whether it was dropping a calabash, stumbling while walking, or crying too loudly at night. And Mom Essie seized every moment to remind Amina that her son was a burden, often dragging neighbors into her accusations, loudly claiming the boy was cursed and would bring ruin to the family. While Amina stood frozen in shame, knowing that defending herself would only worsen the punishment. And so she learned to lower her eyes, to speak softly, to absorb every insult like dry earth absorbs rain. But the insults soon turned toward Kojo himself, as Mom Essie scolded him harshly, slapped his small hands for touching food before permission, and frightened him with stories of evil spirits waiting to claim disobedient children, leaving Kojo trembling and clinging to his mother's wrapper whenever footsteps approached. And though Amina tried to shield him, she was often forced to leave him alone while completing endless chores, during which Mom Essie filled the air with venomous words, telling the boy his mother was weak and that his father would abandon them both. And slowly, Kojo's laughter faded, replaced by silence and distant stares, while his body grew thin and weak, his appetite disappearing as fear settled in his stomach. And when Kofi sent money from the city, Mom Essie controlled it, claiming Amina could not be trusted, feeding Kojo poorly and blaming his sickness on witchcraft rather than neglect. And one evening, after a long day of rain, Kojo accidentally spilled hot porridge while trying to eat quietly in a corner, and Mom Essie exploded with rage, shouting that the child was a demon sent to punish her, slapping the bowl from his hands and screaming until neighbors gathered, while Kojo collapsed in tears and Amina rushed forward, begging softly for mercy, only to be pushed aside and threatened with being sent away in disgrace. And that night, Kojo burned with fever, his small body shaking as if fighting an invisible enemy, while Mom Essie refused to help, insisting the child deserved whatever fate followed him, forcing Amina to sit helplessly through the night, wiping her son's face with damp cloths, whispering prayers through sobs, watching his breath grow shallow, until fear overpowered obedience, and as thunder cracked across the sky and rain poured relentlessly, Amina wrapped Kojo tightly to her chest and ran barefoot into the darkness, ignoring the pain in her feet and the whispers of spirits said to roam at night, driven only by a mother's instinct to save her child, unaware that this desperate escape would mark the beginning of a turning point, not only for her and Kojo, but for everyone who had watched her suffering and said nothing. As fate began to close in on the cruelty that had ruled her life for far too long, Amina reached the old healer's hut just as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, her legs trembling from exhaustion and fear, her clothes soaked, and her heart pounding with the terror of possibly losing the one soul that gave her life meaning. And as the healer carefully examined Kojo, his wrinkled face grew serious, not with superstition, but with understanding, explaining softly that the child's sickness was not the work of evil spirits, but the result of prolonged fear, hunger, and emotional cruelty that had slowly weakened his body. Words that struck Amina harder than any insult she had ever endured, because they confirmed what her heart had always known but had been too afraid to admit. And as Kojo stirred weakly and whispered that he was tired of being shouted at, tired of hiding, and tired of being afraid of his grandmother, something inside Amina finally broke free from years of silent obedience, transforming into a quiet but unshakable resolve. And when the healer advised her to leave the compound if she wished her son to live, warning that returning would undo any healing. Amina felt the heavy chains of tradition pulling at her mind, reminding her that a woman who left her husband's home was often labeled rebellious and ungrateful. Yet, as she looked at her son's fragile body rising and falling with shallow breaths, she chose motherhood over fear, and after Kojo's fever eased slightly, she carried him back to the village not to beg, but to reclaim what little dignity she had left, only to be met by Mom Essie's fury when she arrived, accused of spreading lies and disgrace. And when villagers gathered, drawn by raised voices, Mom Essie loudly declared that Amina had always been troublesome, claiming she used the child's illness to seek sympathy, and, in a final attempt to break her, she shouted that if Amina believed she knew better than elders and tradition, she should take her cursed child and leave forever. Words meant to humiliate her into submission, but instead they echoed like permission, and in that moment Amina bowed her head not in defeat but in acceptance, thanked the elders for sheltering her for as long as they had, took Kojo's small hand, and walked away from the compound without looking back, ignoring the shocked murmurs that followed her steps. And as she left, some villagers felt unease stir in their chests, realizing too late that silence had made them witnesses to cruelty, while Mom Essie stood watching, confident she had won, unaware that she had just released the very people whose suffering had been silently condemning her. And as Amina crossed the edge of the village with her son beside her, she felt fear, uncertainty, and loneliness pressing down on her. But beneath it all was a strange sense of freedom, as if the ancestors themselves were guiding her away from harm. And though she did not yet know where she would sleep or how she would survive, she knew one truth with absolute clarity, that no tradition was worth a child's life, and that the path she had chosen, born from pain and courage, would soon reveal consequences far greater than anyone in the village could imagine. Life beyond the village tested Amina in ways she had never imagined. Yet, for the first time, the hardship did not come wrapped in humiliation or fear, as she and Kojo found shelter in a small town where no one knew their past. And though survival demanded relentless effort, Amina welcomed the exhaustion because it was honest, spending long days washing clothes by the river, selling simple meals at the roadside, and returning at night with aching hands but a lighter heart, because Kojo slept peacefully without fear of angry footsteps or cruel voices. And slowly, under care and kindness, his body began to heal. His appetite returned, his eyes brightened, and his laughter, once stolen, came back like a blessing. While Amina learned that dignity could grow even in the poorest soil when watered with courage, and as word of her disappearance reached Kofi, the truth his mother had hidden for years began to unravel, forcing him to confront his silence. And when he finally came to the town and saw his son's thin scars of suffering and his wife's quiet strength, regret washed over him heavier than shame, realizing too late that love without action is betrayal, and choosing at last to stand beside Amina, promising to protect the family he had once failed. Yet, while healing blossomed in one place, darkness settled in another. As Mom Essie's life in the village began to unravel, her crops failing despite careful planting, her animals dying without clear cause, and neighbors growing distant, whispering that the ancestors were displeased, And the same woman who once commanded fear now faced isolation, haunted by memories of a crying child and a daughter-in-law who had walked away without curses. And when illness struck her body, leaving her weak and dependent, no one rushed to her aid, as she had once refused compassion, forcing her to confront the emptiness left by cruelty. And in her lonely nights, she replayed her words and actions, feeling for the first time the weight of the pain she had inflicted, unaware that while she suffered consequences shaped by her own deeds, the woman she had tried to destroy was quietly building a life rooted in peace. And as Amina watched Kojo run and play under an open sky, she knew that walking away had not been an act of rebellion, but an act of survival, one that was slowly reshaping their destiny and preparing the final lesson this story was yet to deliver. Years passed like a slow but steady river, carrying Amina and Kojo farther away from the pain that once defined their lives. And in that time, the boy who had trembled at angry voices grew into a strong, intelligent child, known in the town for his kindness and calm nature, while Amina, once mocked and silenced, became respected for her resilience, her food stall growing into a small but steady business, her name spoken with admiration rather than pity. And though the scars of the past never fully vanished, they no longer controlled her steps, yet fate, as it often does, found a way to bring unfinished chapters back into the light. When news arrived that Mom Essie had fallen gravely ill and had been brought to the town by distant relatives, her once commanding presence reduced to a fragile figure weighed down by regret. And when she finally stood before Amina, the power she once wielded was gone, replaced by trembling hands and eyes filled with shame, and in a broken voice, she confessed that jealousy and fear of losing her son had hardened her heart, turning her into someone she barely recognized, admitting that she had blamed Amina and Kojo for her own loneliness and bitterness, expecting anger or rejection in return. But Amina listened in silence, feeling the old wounds ache, yet refusing to let bitterness rule her spirit. And she spoke calmly, explaining that forgiveness does not erase suffering or excuse cruelty, but it frees the wounded from carrying pain into the future. Words that hung heavy in the air, and as Kojo stepped forward, offering his grandmother water with a quiet, respectful smile, the moment shattered the final walls of denial, leaving Mom Essie weeping openly, surrounded by witnesses who understood for the first time that abuse often hides behind tradition and authority, and that breaking such cycles requires courage greater than revenge. And in that simple act of compassion, the town learned that true strength lies not in domination, but in choosing humanity over hatred, even when forgiveness costs more than anger ever could. In the years that followed, Amina and Kojo's story, not as gossip, but as truth shaped by lived pain and hard-won wisdom, because Kojo grew into a young man grounded in empathy rather than anger, excelling in his studies, helping other children who carried invisible wounds, and speaking gently about respect whenever he could, knowing too well what cruelty steals from a child, while Amina, now steady and self-reliant, became a voice for women who believed endurance was their only option, reminding them that tradition should protect, not destroy, and that dignity is not rebellion. And as Mom Essie lived out her remaining days in quiet reflection, her strength replaced by humility, she no longer ruled by fear but by silence, changed by the understanding that authority without compassion is emptiness. And when she finally passed, there were no curses spoken and no celebrations held, only a sober acknowledgment of a life that had taught others what not to become. And at her funeral, Amina stood beside Kojo, not out of obligation, but because healing does not require hatred, and as elders spoke of ancestors and balance, many reflected on how easily silence can turn good people into witnesses of harm, and how courage, once shown, spreads like fire in dry grass, igniting change where none seemed possible. And Kojo later returned to the village, not as a victim, but as a reminder, helping rebuild the school, speaking to fathers about listening and mothers about strength, while children gathered around him, drawn to the calm confidence of someone who had survived darkness without becoming it. And as the sun set over the red earth and the drums echoed during evening gatherings, the village slowly reshaped its values, understanding at last that bullying poisons generations, but compassion restores them. And so the tale of Amina and her son did not end with revenge or triumph, but with transformation, teaching that when a woman chooses her child's life over fear, when a man learns that silence is also a choice, and when a community accepts responsibility for what it allows, the future bends toward justice, and beneath the wide African sky, with ancestors watching and children laughing freely, the truth settled into memory, that cruelty always leaves consequences, but courage, once awakened, can heal even the deepest wounds and light a path forward for those yet to come.